From the background that I bring, I really like to speak with you today mostly about how you get the translation of a well-known classic, in a sense, botanical medicine, and basically bring it to light and reintegrate it as a botanical medicine. So in the title there, or the subtitle really, are all the components of translational research and integrative medicine. So as full disclosure, as we're obligated to do, this is a CME course. If you notice, the third attestation from the bottom talks about if you're discussing anything that's off-label. Well, the reality of it is, and the site's going to come up in just a second. There we go. Everything I'm going to speak about is off-label because it's Schedule 1. So bear in mind that that's the context in which education is having a somewhat challenging time of going along, let alone the research constraints you hear. But ultimately, that's the attestation you probably should be most familiar with. So it's about 4 years ago when this appeared. Now this is from the NIH, and these are two well-known respecters, Pal Packer and George Kunos. These are MD, PhD researchers. These are people who know more about than what pot may do to a lab rat. And when they came out with their summary statement about endocannabinoid science saying that there's therapeutic potential in almost all diseases affecting humans, I said, wow, really? I don't really remember a more remarkable global statement for where this potentially could go. But that was a very powerful statement. So if there's anything I'd like to share with you, is that ultimately this discovery of a relatively new endocannabinoid system, it's not new at all, it's ancient, it's the way we're hardwired, but a new discovery is really not about a plant at all. It's about how we're hardwired in that sense. So because the plant is so famously distracting, I like to make this akin to an archer, where if you really want to shoot bullseyes, you don't get distracted by anything. You're a pure focus research scientist, and as a clinician, think that way now also, because if you're distracted by, and I put the little cannabis leaf on the arrow there, any archer knows you distract your thought or your eyes to the arrow, you're not purely focused and you'll shoot misses. So in essence, keeping things simple that way is the reason I like to approach it like this. There will be a few slides. There's no tests on this from the detail point. I'll do it because you're docs and very often interested at this level. But overall, it's about the chemistry in a plant. And Mike Pollan, actually, in one of his books and talks, says about plants that they nourish us, they poison us, and they delight our senses of sight, smell, and taste. They calm and awake our nerves or wake us up, and they even can change the content of our minds and the experience of our consciousness. And I grew up in this community, and I can tell you that while I don't use, and growing up in this community in the early 1970s, if you didn't know about cannabis, you were probably growing up under a rock. So in that sense, all I want to say is that people I know said, hey doc, what does it mean to be stoned? And I say, well, isn't that a profound question, because we don't understand what consciousness truly is, so how can you know what a change of consciousness is? Leave that to the poets. So in a sense then, as scientists, we're confronted with botanical medicines that for eons have been known to have chemicals in them called alkaloids. Plant alkaloids are what the plants generally use for their own defenses, to attract a pollinator, such as a smell, which would be terpenes, different than alkaloids, but those other chemicals in not only morphine, caffeine, cocaine, chocolate, nicotine. Obviously, some of those are legal, some are illegal. They're all addicting. If you want to go ahead and even consider that about caffeine and chocolate, go think about that. But obviously, some are plant substances with different scheduling by the DEA. We'll talk about that, as well as the botanical medicines themselves that culturally are just accepted for that. Most of these are about then plant alkaloids. Cannabinoids are not alkaloids. They're different in chemical structure, function, and how they work. And I'll try to impart upon you some background to tell you why this particular receptor system works differently than any other receptor system and is involved in every other receptor system, virtually everything in physiology, which is how come that first paper's remarkable statement says its therapeutic potential potentially affects everything. And so if you go back to when plant alkaloids and discoveries were made. The 1947 Nobel Prize went to work in chemistry where those plant alkaloids were found, and Sir Robert Robertson's work was really quite remarkable at that point, because in his citation speech he talks about how in indigenous peoples, the ways that they work, maybe not the mechanisms, but what for and what to expect, often goes back to prehistoric times. And so the realization of that, in this case, Dr. Robertson, he synthesized the precursors to cocaine in the early 1900s. You get to be an old man, usually an octogenarian, before you get the Nobel Prize. But that's his background. But when we talk about chemistry, you might think, okay, well, this is the next millennia, it's about genetics, all right? The Human Genome Project ushering in the new millennia. And to give you an idea about the complexity in plant chemistry, think about this. I believe the Human Genome Project says there's approximately 35,000 genes that each of us have as human beings. Anybody care to guess? Rice, simple grain of rice. All right, how many, what's the genetics in that? Closer to 50,000 genes. And you go, why? They've had a lot longer to work on making chemicals. That's what plants do. So in terms of how chemically close we are to plants, I love this slide. Yeah, Dave mentioned I'm a plantsman. I've grown plants pretty much all my life, tropical ornamentals in particular. But when I finished school here, I go off to Emory and I get a degree in chemistry where they showed me what the molecule of chlorophyll looks like. It's on the left over there. And if you look closely, I know the print may be a little small, but you'll see that the molecule of chlorophyll has a central cation. It's a 2+ charged cation, for those of you who may not remember that chemistry. Magnesium is used in farming the same way that you as docs would use iron for people with hemoglobin issues. A pregnant woman, you want to optimize hemoglobin. A plant that's under stress, a farmer's going to give extra magnesium. The same way, you're not going to get an imbalance with that chemical and something else. Just give as much as you need to fulfill that central spot, and chlorophyll will work. Give enough iron to fulfill the hemoglobin to do what it's doing, and it works. But here's the trick. Human beings walk around and need energy in terms of oxygen delivery. Hemoglobin's essential. Plants are existentially rooted where they are. They can't move around. So they developed a really cool trick. How do you use light to make your food? Think about that. So the complexities in chemicals and similarities between plants and people as an evolutionary prelude to where we are today is quite remarkable. And advances in that don't only stay with cannabis or cocaine. Even the Nobel Prize just a couple of years ago, everybody remember seeing this? Okay, artemisinin, an ancient plant known in Chinese culture that was almost resurrected. Nobel Prize goes for the treatment of basically parasitic type illnesses, elephantosis, malaria, things like that. So what's old is new again, and in that sense, here's ancient healers' compassionate care wisdom. It gets shared generationally. Before there were Hippocrates or before there was Imhotep, where you're actually writing down, those kind of secrets were passed along from culture to culture. So again, this is the ethnobotanical part, but here's the neat part about cannabis in particular compared to most other botanical medicines. Cannabis has its literal evolutionary roots coming and found to be one of very few plants that existed along with human beings in areas after the Ice Age or during the Ice Age known as refugia. There's one that if you see the red spot there, this is the eastern slopes of the Himalayas, and the earliest use of human beings interacting with cannabis can be traced back there. There was another smaller refugia to the way left of the slide. You see the little one closer to Europe. And in fact, there were different kinds of cannabis strains because the ones that were found off the eastern slopes of the Himalayas were drug varietals of cannabis. And cannabis has another varietal to it that's used for textiles. Cannabis, as in hemp, was more prevalent in the European areas, and that's part of the reason that basically centuries, thousands of years later, Columbus's ships, when they went from Europe to here, the sails and the riggings were made of hemp. So in essence then you can trace back even 700 BC here, ancient Chinese tombs of a shaman, where those vessels that the arrows are pointing to contained not only cannabis, but female cannabis flowered buds. And female flowering buds in the plant are where the most concentrated chemicals are found, and yet normally in indigenous fields and what they call landrace populations, those female plants are found along with male plants because they are very free flowering and very free pollinating. They found that once you separate the girls from the boys, the girls kept pushing their buds to getting longer and juicier and full of all these structures called trichomes where the chemicals are made, and they were found 700 BC. This is nothing new. So the plant then evolved around the world, but it evolved in a unique way. Most plants find their way around the world with vectors, such that ferns, for instance, have spores, not seeds, and they fly with air. So even before most animals and most insects that way, ferns actually got from point A to point B, again, not being able to walk through air. Then you have other pollinators, bees, things like that. You have plants that make fruits. Fruit falls, animal eats it, walks over there, defecates out the seed comes up over there. The plants have devised ways to move, and cannabis is unique because the vector that cannabis is known to go around the world has been through human agriculture. And that's 10,000 years of human agriculture, which sort of begs the question, evolutionary-wise, isn't 10,000 years of evolution that human beings have used it maybe instead of in a lab rat for a short knockout experiment? I think evolution could be considered as the ultimate knockout experiment. So moving along then, this would be Imhotep, and I want to just share with you a little bit of who I am and what I bring, because while this is an important and powerful message of how it got through with healers, I love this quote from Hippocrates that nature itself is the best healer. And Hippocrates didn't only do that, but of course the Hippocratic Oath, and I'm in front of you today just trying to say I'm not here to tell you about pot or to champion it or anything. We're scientists, we're not only researchers, but most importantly clinicians and humanity serving at that. So this is one of the things I've been honored to do and privileged to give the oath of medicine, telling docs what's the right thing to do, because this field and subject is mired in the last 85 years with issues concerning, obviously, prohibition, what's legal and what's not. So it started in 1935. This is a brief slide.
We're having a hop at the local soda fountain. Innocently they dance. Innocent of a new and deadly menace lurking behind closed doors. Marijuana. The burning weed with its roots in hell. In this film, you will see the ease with which this vicious plant can be grown in your neighbor's yard, rolled into harmless-looking cigarettes, hidden in an innocent shoe or watch case.
If you want a good smoke, try one of these.
You will meet Bill, who once took pride in his strong will as he takes the first step toward enslavement.
Of course, if you're afraid.
Smoking the soul-destroying reefer, they find a moment's pleasure, but at a terrible price. Debauchery, violence, murder, suicide, and the ultimate end of the marijuana addict. Hopeless insanity. See this important film now, before it is too late.
All right, so as he's clutching his chest at the end, you may even hear some things about people talking about in adult use, all the strong strengths, maybe sudden cardiac things. A lot of the research and findings you'll find are not alarmist. They're just saying you got to learn more about it. And so the idea is that this was a mindset of 80 plus years ago. And yet it comes at a time when that could be understandable, because in actuality, this way that prohibition has spread across the land, and I'm not going to take too much time, this is not so much a social history course, but to understand it would be that it was around 1930, it was in 1937, this trailer comes out before, heading the way towards prohibition across as the law of the land. It actually started in 1910 in California, and it was started largely as a result, strangely enough, of what may have been the first real terrorist attack on U.S. soil, not the World Trade Center or Pentagon planes going into them, but actually Pancho Villa from Mexico, not representing Mexico government, coming in, seizing some land and killing Americans. Associating with Pancho Villa was marijuana, the first time that word was used. Before that, everything in medicine, pharmacy was all cannabis, not only legal, but accepted in pharmacy, from Europe and the Americas for decades. So the essence then of one of the most damning things, which is why I'm so happy to be here for you from an educational focus, is that at that same time, the American Medical Association was responding to the fact that along with prohibition came a position on the part of the government not to publish any longer what's called the United States Pharmacopoeia. That's the government published in their forms of monographs issues that deal with other plant and botanical substances, we could call it, like St. John's wort. All those things have the United States Pharmacopoeia providing education information. By 1942, the government stopped publishing that, figuring, well, it's illegal, we really don't want to do that. And yet, organized medicine, the AMA said, look, there's an unknown quantity, but it might just have important uses in medicine and psychology. That went unheard. So, in essence, we're back here today looking at it again from a research and education perspective, because in a new science where the mechanism of action was just identified in the early 1990s as being a receptor-based system, it's hard to say there's no education precedes research or research precedes education. But I'll tell you, if you look at any textbooks older than maybe 15 years old, you'd be very hard-pressed to find anything concerning endocannabinoid science in medical or pharmacy books. So knowing the law is important, because look, we're all law-abiding citizens. We're here in Florida. I can tell you that the laws in each state make it extraordinarily challenging to keep up with the pace of what's legal versus right and wrong. But you need to know this. The law is the law. The law of the land is largely at this point through what is called the Controlled Substances Act, which in 1970 set up those schedules of Schedule 1, 2, 3, and so on. Cannabis is a Schedule 1 substance by definition, and that definition is pretty straightforward. The definition defining the scheduling of drugs is that a Schedule 1 drug fulfills 3 criteria. It has a high potential for abuse, no currently accepted medical use, and a lack of accepted safety. So there have been challenges to that by petitions for a long time now, but actually just in January, the very important paper came out from the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and it did look at an exhaustive look at thousands and thousands of issues in the literature, and they came up with responses really to see now what is the state of affairs. And with respect to the first criteria of high potential for abuse, yes, there's a greater frequency of cannabis use in people who use it and develop problem use, but especially when it starts at a younger age, promotes a greater likelihood of developing it. With respect to no therapeutic use, that key comment there, and that you probably hear a lot about today, they found that there was really conclusive evidence with respect to cannabinoids as antiemetics, specifically for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, cisplatin ones in particular. Limited evidence, though, associated with the weight loss from HIV and AIDS, which is where those brownies that are laced with things came to light in the mid to late 1980s, when patients with AIDS were finding out that if they did consume cannabis within brownies, their appetite was stimulated, because back then there were really 2 things that patients with AIDS died from. It was pneumocystis carinii pneumonia and wasting syndrome, thin man disease. That was probably the first politically effective, not really, but compassionate cry out for let's see what it does medically. But that's in the 80s. The mechanism of action in the 90s has really promulgated what today is a different cry, and it doesn't come from patients afflicted with AIDS, it comes from children. Children with intractable forms of epilepsy, Dravet syndrome in particular. We're finding out a few years ago, Sanjay Gupta did his CNN series, Weeds 2 it was, where he showed a certain patient, a little girl named Charlotte Figi in Colorado, being helped with CBD oil, CBD being the other principal cannabinoid in addition to THC. We'll get into the balances of that later, but it did at least show enough to where he himself did a mea culpa, saying, you know what, I was wrong about this, it really does look like it works. I'll have you know that today, the issue of is epilepsy one of those that has evidence-based, because you didn't see it on the slide here. The answer is no, not quite yet. It's currently in phase 3 studies, and maybe by the end of the year we'll know more. But in terms of the process of translational research, presenting enough evidence-based data to say it's really ready for prime time, not quite. And don't lose sight of that, because there's a lot of people who would like to say an anecdotal suspicion about something, oh, it must work. No, not necessarily. We're scientists. We have a certain standard that we look for, and it hasn't quite reached that yet. And frankly, the plural of anecdote is not data. And that's the message in there. So we've been getting different messages from the top docs in the country on this, and you can see they're fairly mixed. Remember, surgeon generals are appointed, and the predisposition of the given administration that may appoint one may very often determine their attitude towards not accepting for research or education or maybe legalization cannabis. Starting back when I got out of medical school in this institution in 1982 was C. Everett Koop. Did great things, by the way, with respect to developing a position on nicotine and smoking, secondhand smoke. The fact is, smoking is still the leading cause of preventable death in the world by far. And so the position on that was established starting back then, today, has cigarettes no longer socially accepted. Its social use is dropping, its actual use is dropping, and that's a public health victory. In contrast to maybe when I'm a kid and somebody says, hey Jeff, you want to go get a smoke? They're talking about a cigarette, nicotine, regular tobacco. Today, somebody says that, hey, you want to go smoke or vape? They're talking about cannabis. The two are inextricably combined. Cannabis and nicotine, even combined with leaves for overall effect, is very often how it's taken in other cultures as well as here. And the irony there is that cannabis, in contrast to tobacco, which is legal, is illegal. I don't know at this point we need to throw another inner city kid in jail because of having a joint, but its social use is increasing and its overall use is increasing. The position I like to take, and if I may explain it plain and simple, is that as 2017 comes here, I don't particularly think it should be illegal federally, but I don't think people should be using it too much either, as that evidence continues to become available for what else it may work for. So today's Surgeon General, Dr. Murthy, up on the top right there, actually is from South Florida. I went to high school here at Palmetto High School, no more than 10 miles south, in the class of 1974, and then I came back to Miami after going up to Atlanta to school, but Dr. Murthy actually is the class of 1994 from that same high school. He was valedictorian. Sorry I wasn't. But here he is in terms of his disposition on it.
We have to see what the science tells us about the efficacy of marijuana. And I think we're going to get a lot more data on that. We have some preliminary data showing that for certain medical conditions and symptoms that marijuana can be helpful. So I think that we have to use that data to drive policymaking, and I'm very interested to see where that data takes us.
Dr. Vivek Murthy, we thank you doing your first live interview with us here on CBS.
Can I see a show of hands? Clinicians, who actually sees patients? Oh, well, much more than half of you. I'd like to show you this next slide because this was published in 2013 in the New England Journal, and it's a case study. And it'll reveal perhaps your attitudes about how you regard a patient coming and wanting to know, here's what I got. Hey, doc, is marijuana, can I try it? So this is a case, and I'm going to read it to you directly from what the New England Journal had, because it's still a good teaching moment. So you're the clinician. Here you go. Marilyn's a 68-year-old woman with breast cancer, and it's metastatic to her lungs and to her thoracic and lumbar spine. And she's currently undergoing chemotherapy with doxorubicin, and she reports having very low energy, minimal appetite, and substantial pain in her thoracic and lumbar spine. So to relieve nausea, she takes, well, Zofran there and prochlorazine, compazine, but really with minimal success. And she's been taking some Tylenol every 8 hours for pain. And at night, she sometimes takes 5 or 10 milligrams of oxycodone to help provide pain relief. But remember, she's complaining about pain. So she says to her primary care doc, she says, hey, how about marijuana? How about cannabis to help alleviate that nausea, pain, and fatigue? And she lives in a state where it can be grown, but this was an example from another state. So let's just say she's here, you're licensed in this state, or you may come from another state in the country. She wants to know, can she access it? What are you going to tell her? Can I see a show of hands? How many people think that with her complaints and what she knows, is that the first thing you would do? Okay, would you do anything else? Acupuncture. Keep going.
Chiropractic.
Chiropractic. Keep going.
Turmeric. Omega-3s.
Omega-3s.
Radiation.
Okay, I'm getting a lot of naturopathic, homeopathic, not alternative. I hate that word, alternative. Complementary medicine, integrative medicine modalities. Okay, East meets West. Well, the context of the talk, yes, it's a botanical medicine talk. We're talking about things pertaining to Eastern culture, combinations of chemicals. A traditional Chinese medicine doc would never dream of giving one particular medicine to a patient. It always would be a cocktail of things, in a sense. And cannabis itself has a cocktail of chemicals. But here's the point that I'm trying to make. Cannabis in 2017 is not a first-line treatment for any debilitating disease. What that lady really needed is she needs radiation to her lumbar and thoracic spine. That's where her pain's coming from. And she's seeing you as a doctor to avail her of all of these modalities. Perhaps if she had that approached first, instead of going almost to the immediate palliative mindset, oh, here, have pot, it's important to remember the causation. So in essence, then she needs radiation, and then consider along with it as a therapeutic measure cannabis, because it could help her. I showed you how pain was one of those diagnoses, and that's a valuable contribution to it. So for THC and its effect on pain, the best evidence again is for chemotherapy, chronic pain, and muscle spasms from MS. But cannabinoids, they can be helpful in other things. The jury's still out. It's not really ready with evidence-based data yet for hepatitis C, cancer pain, lower urinary tract infections, and fibromyalgia in particular. And there seems to be little benefit for glaucoma, ALS, and Parkinson's, yet those are things that are grouped into these popular diagnoses when it's legislated. I can tell you why there's pushback from organized medicine. Doctors hate to be told what chemicals they can use for what diseases. Last time I looked, it was called the practice of medicine. And why would we want to be legislated that from politicians in industry that are not licensed to do what we do? So that's one aspect of it, but realize that mainstream docs are not rushing in to see a patient who wants pot, because they're dealing with two licenses. Their state license that may permit it, but their federal DEA license that they regard, and not without cause, to be threatened at a federal level if they were to authorize patients to get pot. Technically, you can't prescribe it because it's Schedule I, but authorize, recommend, those are the euphemism, other words. But as a threat to possibly having the federal government revoke your DEA license, your tool bag, who do you think is going to see a patient in that context when that's possibly at risk? So, in essence then, CBD, which is what's really interesting in looking at now from those phase 3 studies I said may reveal themselves this calendar year, is interesting, and even schizophrenia. Work's being done throughout the world in different areas. Israel's probably a decade ahead of any place else in the world on this, but other countries are doing remarkable research. The Spanish doing things with particularly glioblastomas and things in the brain. The Germans test for what Germans are known for, psychosis, schizophrenia. Italians for metabolic syndrome. There's good work being done elsewhere in the world. It's coming to light now. But at 2017 start, other than those big three on top, everything else is anecdotal. Stay tuned. So this could be my mom. This was what really got me kind of annoyed when I saw us depicted this way. I'm an FMA member, and this doc didn't seem to be really responding to a legitimate question into either compassionate nor educated way. And it kind of bothered me, because here's what the politically effective mantra of AIDS patients, patients who have epilepsy, and now more recently issues of vets with PTSD and high suicide rates. Those are all compassionate mantras that are very politically successful marching across the country. Well, this doc is coming across in the political cartoon as being uncompassionate. But don't make any mistake about it. We're scientists. We understand evidence-based data, so we know that that scientific discovery process, and indeed the scientific method itself, is based on dispassion. I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, you're not supposed to be swayed by the heartstrings of this issue. And so don't confuse people saying, oh, doctors aren't compassionate. No. You behave the way you would, but don't confuse when the press says something like, oh, well, they're uncompassionate. It's good to be dispassionate. That's how you'll discover facts from the fiction. So the poppy flower and cannabis itself is pretty interesting, because both were germane in discovering receptor systems revealed by the plant And in fact, when you talk about a healthy runner and the runner's high, known to probably interact with endorphin systems for that kind of feedback, the good feel, the dopamine that comes out of it, artificially from the plant, but naturally from the endorphin system, these are all things that you could think of the endocannabinoid system having a healthy basis as well. The issue with opiates, though, is particularly important now for everything you read and hear of what's going on. So in the way that an anesthesiologist looks at this kind of field to mitigate some of the side effects of one drug, you combine another. Balanced risk reduction, that's what we do every day. And I can tell you that whether we're using opiates or other things to mitigate pain, even the stress that goes along with it, with benzodiazepines and things like that, so that the stress levels don't make the pain seem worse, we use these in a balanced risk reduction way, and I never made money putting a patient to sleep. I got paid waking them up, better than they were when they went to sleep. So this is a key point here. The history of this goes back basically through Israel. Dr. Meshulam here is from Israel, and only back in the mid-60s was the actual chemical structure for the first time of THC elucidated, and later on he went in 92 as a major contributor to find those endogenous ligands, those chemicals in our body that cannabis is mimicking. Don't think that our body's mimicking cannabis, it's the other way around. Without boring you too much, and there's no test on this later, on top in yellow, GPP, is the parent compound for not only the cannabinoids that the plant makes, but also the terpenes. These are the things, like I said, they're in plants. They're what give plants their fragrance. They work together with the cannabinoids that are downstream in ways that the plant itself is a compound of chemicals. To extract any one plant chemical from that and to try to say it does what the whole plant does would be a misrepresentation of the way the plants evolved under human culture. So genetically, there's a lot of work being done now to try to have certain strains feature one cannabinoid or another in an effort to, in essence, recreate what might have been around 1,000 years ago. Because remember, what evolved in one part of the world in one race's use may be very different than the homogenized versions that are there today, where we have many people of many races living in different places, but here we're all mixed up. And yet that's why essentially the essence of basically what is personalized medicine finds a great shortcoming pharmaceutically, because that which may have worked for one culture developing that plant in one part of the world may not be as effective in another. So this is becoming sent to light because this is how profound the CB1 and CB2, there are actually two kinds of receptors. In the top left in green, there's showing receptors as of about 3 years ago. They're multiple, and I don't know about you, but when I'm in medical school in the late 70s, what did we have? Tagamet, H2 blocker. This is how complicated the receptors are. That was my career. Now I'm looking at it from a genetics perspective, but the cool part is, I'll show you in a moment how the endocannabinoid system affects all of these others. This is how. This is a beautiful, pretty slide by Phytex. And what they did is they took a neuron, sliced it in half to show you the presynaptic side on top, the postsynaptic surface on the bottom. And you could apply this to nearly any kind of those vacuoles on top that are ready to release their contents. As you've always been taught, a nerve impulse comes down, hits the presynaptic side, chemicals are released, picked up on the postsynaptic side, and there it goes. It's not really a one-way street. And that's the cool part about how these CB receptors work. What happens is that the body's own chemicals, anandamide and 2-AG are the names of the two principal ligands that we all have in us. They act as a little feedback loop at every junction, and by feeding back, they actually attenuate the release of what's coming from the presynaptic side, real time, all the time. And so, in fact, what I'd like you to do is look at how cool this is, because on the bottom you have anandamide and 2-AG. You see them there? And the arrows coming up in sort of that pinkish color and the turquoise green color. It is a reverse path. The ligands come retrograde, interface with CB receptors in all of these nerves, and then the CB receptor in turn changes the output of whatever is being released from the presynaptic side. That is the feedback loop that the endocannabinoid system serves. And it's subtle, but it's absolutely essential to maintaining a homeostatic balance, modulating. Basically, those words, homeostasis, modulating, they're too complicated. They keep you in balance, but on a cellular and synaptic level everywhere in your body. So understanding that, and this works real time, all big pharma companies are working with the endogenous system right now. Because they know when you take a receptor and you shape it and have it function differently, there's a myriad of things you can do to affect the outflow stream. You can have inverse agonist, total agonist, partial agonist, reverse agonist. This is a very complicated system that has probably a generation or two of exciting research ahead in modulating that. So the pharmaceutical companies are looking more than anything else right now at what enzymes break down the body's own natural ligands, and they're working on inhibiting those to see if boosting up the levels of the body's own ligands can affect the action that they would have on the CB receptors themselves. There's some exciting work along those lines through what are called negative allosteric modulators. What that means is an allosteric modulator changes the shape of the receptor to affect some of the functions, but not necessarily all. And it's known that pregnenolone now can actually affect the effects of THC selectively, so perhaps you wouldn't have the side effects, not that there's anything wrong with euphoria, but in some situations you don't need to have what is otherwise inextricably connected to the effects of cannabis be featured in everybody who uses it. So these are all through negative allosteric modulators, and cannabidiol, which is the second primary component of the phyto or plant-derived cannabinoid that complements THC. CBD is actually a fascinating chemical in that it appears that it works not only there, but it works in many other ways throughout the body. It may be the epitome of polypharmacy. And so if you think back to another plant-based molecule that was exploited for pain, pure from the willow bark, aspirin. When they first were dealing with it, oh, here's a pain reliever, natural, and it works. And think about all the things that aspirin's now known to do today, years later. Watch that for cannabidiol in the future. It's an exciting chemical. So where does THC work? Where do you get the psychotropic effects? Many areas of the brain, including the one in the yellow bottom for memory. The reason I'm bringing this up is to show you that there are no endocannabinoid receptors in the brainstem. That's why you can't OD on it and stop breathing the way you can with cannabinoids, even the effects on the brain from alcohol. So it's unique this way. People say it's safe. Oh, nobody ever died from it. Well, no, not from an overdose that way, but surely people drift off the road and have other consequences from its indiscriminate use, because it does affect coordination. So in essence then, here's the part I thought that this slide would really resonate with you as far as your interest in holistic medicine and integrative medicine. I believe that this is the system that describes that long thought brain-gut reaction connection, because if you think about the way CB1 and CB2 receptors integrate, it's this. The endocannabinoid system is unique because CB1 is generally regarded as in the brain, those receptors, but the CB2 receptors are down here in the gut, the immune system. It actually is very interesting that the immune system as we know it is something that's meant to be there to respond to protein invaders, bacteria, viruses. But what happens when you get a disease that allows you to live with that disease? This is what the system does. CB2 receptors in the immune system show up in response to a disease, and actually exactly where you think it would be related to where that disease is, even organ system wise. The reason that's interesting is because these are the subtle things that are built into us to allow a disease to become chronic. We all die from one thing, but with lots of other chronic diseases, this is the receptor system and the changes that you have in physiology that allows that to happen. So the next group of slides I want you to try to pay clinical attention to, because when I started this talk, I emphasized it's really not about the plant. It's about the way we're hardwired. So to know what and how this clinical systems application could do, it's important to have some framework from which to think about not just health and wellness, but for the endocannabinoid system, those particular functions that it affects. Vincenzo Di Marzo is an Italian researcher and the world's most frequently cited researcher, and back in 1998, he said that relaxing, eating, sleeping, forgetting, and protecting, those 5 things, might be some of the messages that are produced by the actions of the endocannabinoids alone or in combination with other mediators. So I took those 5 things and I want to share with you how I teach this subject for clinical application. I'd like you to think about those 5 things in a timeline working between the brain and the gut or body in the context of life. And life, of course, focusing through the endocannabinoid system now can be thought of as starting with conception and ending with death. So in looking at those 5 modalities, I didn't go in the same order as DiMarzo because I'm a clinician and he's a researcher. So for clinical application, I wanted you to think about a moment for those things that we said the endocannabinoid receptor system's there to do. Its main health function is to be there so it sustains an organism by adjusting its physiology. So in that sense, the CB1 receptors that are largely brain function now do two things in particular, eating and sleeping from brain, but they also do 2 more. They actually, after the initial conception and the growth part of life, maybe the first 20 years where eating and sleeping is absolutely essential to healthy growth, once you hit your stride and then you're in the middle age, if you don't think it's important to have ways to relax and forget 2 of the other issues that DiMarzo cited as what it's for, it is. That's what keeps us really being able to sustain ourselves in the game. CB2 receptors, on the other hand, those things down in the immune system that I tell you respond to chronic diseases, are really there in ways that are designed to protect us, and that's why protect was one of those things he has there. So when I like to present it, we live in a very finely balanced point as we get older especially. That's why I put the bottom on a little triangular pedestal, because maintaining that balance is essential. The endocannabinoid system does that. And whether you're a plant, an animal, or even a whole system with this, you guys know what happens when you get unbalanced as a natural entity? You become extinct or die. So let's look at these components: eat, sleep, relax, forget, and then protect. And you can put your own connection to cannabis and how it's used, but remember, I'm not going to present it in context with that, because in a more holistic sense, the issues of eating and sleeping in particular as essential from conception right through the growth, say around again 20 years, there's a lot of concerns around that age, 20, 25, because when kids get pot, especially when you start younger, the brain hasn't stopped forming yet. Those connections, including those elements of endocannabinoid receptors and function, haven't yet developed fully. So what happens then when you undermine or even downregulate in a young person the amount of receptors that's there? That's a scary proposition if your brain hasn't stopped forming yet. But eating and sleeping, again, if you're to think about it in terms of the way most people use cannabis, the munchies, sleeping, more people use it probably right before bedtime than anything else. But again, forgetting it about in that context, eating and sleeping is essential to well-being. So this does not take away what your grandma told you about get plenty of rest, drink plenty of good, eat this, eat that. This is the essential parts of growth. These are CB1 mediated. Those drives to eat, those drives to have to sleep are absolutely mediated through this system. And then if you go ahead and advance it to the relaxing and the forgetting, the things that later on in life we're dealing with, relaxing, and again, this guy may look like he's chilling out after having a hit, but it doesn't have to be. He's just sitting there relaxing. There has to be time to recover, and yet still let the mindset. It's not sleeping, it's relaxing. It's mediated through the endocannabinoid system, particularly CB1 receptors. The brain is a very fascinating place for this because this involves forgetting. This was the fourth of the components that I was going to bring up to you. Forgetting is annoying when you forget where you left your keys and you're leaving the house, but forgetting is essential to evolution and well-being. And if you don't think that, how many women have had babies here? If a woman could remember the extremes of pain associated with childbirth, there'd probably be no need in our language for the word brother or sister. We'd all be only children. So moving from there, where does it work in the brain? The hippocampus. The hippocampus is where new memories are stored. And this is essential because that part of the brain is rich with CB1 receptors. THC affects it. And if anybody uses pot, or you know people who do, it is not a performance enhancer for memory. And this is why. This is where it is. So yet, why would it be helpful to forget? And again, don't think about the plant. Think about evolution, what's important to be able to do to survive. And so the story I like to give in a prehistoric sense is, let's say we're all part of some ancient prehistoric tribe. Okay, maybe not 100 and 200 of us like here, but a little band of a dozen people or so. And we're out foraging for a squirrel or a fish just to eke out the existence. It's a different essence of time. But let's say that something terrifying happens. Think PTSD, fear, whatever, but not in a GI vet who wants pot for it. Just think about the stress response when you see a wild beast chase you. And that wild beast, imagine something prehistoric, like a wild boar but the size of a Volkswagen. Scary. So you run, you find a tree, you climb up it with everybody else, you're waiting up there, your hearts are pounding, maybe you're bloody, you haven't eaten that day. And nightfall comes and that pig's going to go away or something, you'll eat it. You better recover that night. Could you imagine if you couldn't go to sleep because of the sheer terror of that? What happens? You forget about it. You lose that vivid memory to allow you to sleep, to recover. If you can't forget, you're not going to recover well in that sense. And if you don't recover and get out of that tree first thing at crack of dawn, that pig's coming back to eat you. You haven't eaten the day before. Forgetting is helpful in that evolutionary sense. And would you want to remember everybody that you met in this room and have to every moment of every day? No, it's a selective filter. And that's what the endocannabinoid system does through the amygdala in its functioning to help us all be evolutionary more successful. So what about another extreme? Because I've only talked about it in context of pain from PTSD. We just talked about it. But what about pleasure? In a classic sense, philosophers used to speak about pleasure almost on a continuum with pain. Spinoza, Descartes. That's the way even ancients may have thought of how our brains, how our personalities work. The same way that it's not healthy to remember the extremes of pain, the endocannabinoid system is likely there to probably make it so that it's hard to remember the extremes of pleasure. Because if we could remember the extremes of pleasure, we'd probably be seeking it far more often, not avoiding it like pain, but seeking pleasure. And in essence, then, that may be one of the components to an addictive behavior. And again, not healthy. Don't think pot, don't think drugs now. Think about why you would be hardwired that way. And again, you want to go to the same example of a prehistoric people and how it's helpful to forget extremes of pleasure? How about the same tribe of 12 people going around and just doing whatever they're doing? And in that tribe, you have two members of that tribe who really like the pleasure part. And we're talking ancient times, so there's no pot out there, there's no opiates you go buy at the pharmacy. How would people seek pleasure in those days? Sex. So what happens, and just think through the thought here. You have caveman Og, and he can't keep away, and neither can she from him, Lady Pleistocene. They're always going at it, and they're lagging behind. And everybody else is saying, hey, guys, keep up, or it's dangerous. Keep up with the pack, or go find a cave. But if they don't, and you were a saber-toothed tiger, which two do you think you'd find easiest to pick off first, because they're not paying attention? So how long will that stay in the evolutionary pool? It's helpful to forget the extremes of pleasure, in a sense, like the extremes of pain. And this hasn't been fully worked on yet, but there's some fascinating things ahead for the effects of the endocannabinoid system and ligands on what we really know very little about, personality. Because in essence, all of us in this room have had different experiences of what we're going to avoid from pain or seek in pleasure, and we all probably live in some healthy middle ground to tell us where it's healthy for us. And I promise you, your experiences are different than yours. We're all different this way. So wouldn't it be cool if the endocannabinoid system and its effects to forget therapeutically are some of the major determinants of our personality? So continuing on then, let's get to CB2 receptors, because the CB2 receptors, in essence then, is almost a different realm entirely, but that's the part that I suggested is healthy for how do we protect and how do we stay in the game and respond when we get a disease. That's how you stay in the game, because the protecting part then can be thought of as something that as you're aging, how do you stay where you have not only a healthy immune system, as anybody who receives chemotherapy knows, you don't have a healthy immune system, it's generally game over stem cells. Think about it from that point. Well, The slide I like to show there really is very different in that it involves protecting, but the mechanisms of how it actually works, how the endocannabinoid system influences things like inflammation and apoptosis, endothelial cell activation. These are all endocannabinoid-mediated responses that you could see from the listing there to the right in terms of how this vessel is shown. Alleviate things, inflammation and injury. It's going to be a fascinating thing to look at the gut microbiome and the effects of that, because this is largely endocannabinoid mediated. There's a slide I want to show you, though, about CB2 receptors that to me made a lot of sense. In the last few years, I took a course through this iCamp program that we have here at UM on acupuncture, and I looked at acupuncture charts. Anybody use acupuncture in your practices? Okay. I want to show you a neat slide, because this to me was almost the smoking gun for endocannabinoid system and health and wellness and integrative medicine. Acupuncture chart on the left, I just chose this one depiction. There's a lot of them because there was a density of receptors in the abdomen, so people who don't understand chi flow may not have appreciated it for more than simply a density of receptors there. But the flow of sustaining life then isn't really through the brain or the heart or the lungs. It's all gut, and you know that. So the picture on the right is actually a PET scan, and there were a series of these PET scans done at a few minutes and up to 2 hours later. Is if you look very carefully, just to the left of the letter C on CB2 receptors on the diagram on the right, that's an intravenous site. That's where radioisotope labeled cannabinoids are injected, and 2 hours later, anything that lights up yellow, green, red, that's more blood flow red, but anything that's lighting up is where the CB2 receptors are. Remember I said it parallels immune system? That's where it is. So if you look at just specifically where CB2 receptors are in their density, and you understand that all of this flow goes through a parallel system to the immune system, can you see the connection maybe for how acupuncture and this, that could be a smoking gun to actually show it instead of those mysterious lines that go from this point to that point? This is the gut connection that I was telling you about that I thought was fascinating. So in essence then, I want to shift gears a moment, because I'd like to sort of wrap this up with telling you what's in the future, but first to tell you the important point of doing the right thing. Because this is the ultimate question that you're going to have to answer as clinicians when patients come to you. Should a physician offer compassionate access to cannabis while it's still under federal prohibition? So there are positions that our parent organization, the AMA, has to it that are medical legal in their construct. And so it says in Article 3 of the medical ethics principles there, that a physician shall respect the law and also recognize their responsibility to seek changes in those requirements which are contrary to the best interests of the patient. Well, yes, for some things, and it sounds particularly astute, you should advocate to help your patients be the healthiest they could be. But remember before I told you about how physicians are licensed in 2 respects? And how that federal DEA license, the threat of it is really your tool bag. So it's been very ineffective to do that for mainstream docs to want to do that. And those docs who tend to be the ones advocating for their patients to get pot are ones that are almost reduced to a stereotype of a hippy-dippy doc, if I'm going to say that way. It's not something that is very easy to affect a medical legal change according to the guidelines that would exist in other fields because of the illegality of it. So a few years ago when I wrote the education for the Florida course, I wrote into it in 2 places what is bioethics that I delivered here at the university in January for the Department of Bioethics to determine if you're going to approach the same basic question. It is the same question. Should a physician offer compassionate access to cannabis while under its federal prohibition? The discussion of a bioethical conversation is one that bioethics really only developed after World War II, and we're confronted with things we never had to consider before because of the age of discovery. Think nuclear physics. A decade ago, think stem cells. Think stem cells from the perspective of when stem cells were really revealing what the wonders could have been for it a decade or so ago, and you had the constraints of that point of, this was George Bush 1's, constraints of what cell lines you could work from. That was a big issue. because the docs weren't there to try to make some genetic monster out of something that were from some fears. They were there to do the most good using the best tools they had. And so, in fact, that took a bioethical conversation, which wasn't only doctors and lawyers. It wasn't only medical legal. It involved the whole community. It involved the patients, of course, the teachers, the educators, law enforcement. The whole community is invited to participate in a bioethical discussion. So as an effort to sort of start the ball rolling, I wanted to create a statement that was not a compromise in a Jeffersonian sense where every side gives a little and takes a little and finds some common ground. That hasn't worked in this discussion, but to take the other approach to an ethical position point, which is find something irrefutable. Make an irrefutable statement and then have people say, well, you can't deny that, let's just accept it and go with it. So there are two sentences here. One is going to be from the perspective of a patient and one from you, the healer. And so the way this evolved was to say that, let's say that we were just saying a statement and then having to deal with from the perspective of seeking relief from the physical, psychological, or spiritual symptoms of disease is an instinctual force of human nature and may contribute to medicinal use. The treatment of intolerable symptoms is an honorable task that a society bestows upon its healers to provide humane relief. This is a starting point. This is not etched in gold or in concrete or nothing, stone. This is a starting point to develop a conversation that has some practical insight and just fessing up. This is the way it is, so let us take care of our patients. We're here to do it. You've entrusted us as healers, and get past that conversation if it really does show what it looks like it does from therapeutic value for some things now, perhaps many things in the future. So the problem is this is where we're at, okay? And so when that cart gets ahead of the horse, bad things happen. And in this case, I sort of said that the stakeholders have their understanding of its anecdotal use while the horse itself is really science and reason. So in that sense, watch out what's coming next, because it's money. And that's potentially something politically very powerful, because now you're talking about money, and when you look at issues like this may seem like a complicated slide. It came out this past May, and what it did, I'm going to share with you how industry looks at what it does, and this is the same for alcohol, for tobacco. You can think of this in many respects. The first three columns on the left is frequency of use. It's not meant to be too complicated. The legend on the right basically says, are people using this never, 1 or 2 times a year, 1 or 2 times a month, all the way up to the black, which is 30 times a month or basically daily. And the idea here is that that green etched part and maybe even some of the red are representing people who use it 8, 10 times a month. What that really is meant to represent is a weekend person who uses it, not during the week. Recreationally, therapeutically, knowing the risk benefits. So here's the interesting thing about this slide. If you look at it closely, and this is reported by users themselves, 1/3 of all cannabis users report that they use it weekends like that. But it only represents 2% of all the cannabis consumed. That last column on the right is consumption. That's what an industry is going to look at for who's going to use and who they're going to sell to. So in that sense, that part of the use is more or less political fodder for industry, okay? Because those are voters, those are stakeholders, of which there really are 4 stakeholders in this. There's the people who don't use it at all. Well, there's the legislators themselves in government. That's one stakeholder. You have people who use it, we could say discriminately, but at least not all the time, but whether therapeutically or not, on weekends. Another group could be people who don't use it at all, and their stakeholder may not want it. But in essence, most stakeholders would think in favor of having it available. It's the difference of how much should it cost and what other constraints. But you have another group of stakeholders, and those are the people who use it every day. And we both know people who can hold their alcohol. I promise you, you probably know personally people who can hold their THC. And don't confuse that with what the lower left says, because the lower left of 10% of all cannabis users is about the rate of what the accepted rate of chemical dependence on it is, about 10%. And so those are people who really are your everyday or 30 times a month users. Well, look, that represents on the consumption side more than half of all the consumption are from those people. Many of those people who use it every day are not the people in society who are able to necessarily defend for themselves. Some of them come from the most challenging places in our society, and they're dependent on it. And that will be whom industry is focused on, because that's who's buying the product. The same way that I promise you, when you go to your food store, the housewife buying a $12 bottle of Chablis to have with dinner once a weekend night is not sustaining the alcohol industry. So this is essence like that, and there's lessons to be learned from it that now are being learned across the country, because those are states that have different laws now. Florida just became a state that was now fully medical because our constitutional amendment here last November includes THC. But what I want to share with you about this that's actually fascinating is, if you looked before November 8th of last year when the elections were, you would have seen 4 states that had recreational, or otherwise called adult use, laws. And they were Colorado, Washington State, Oregon, and Alaska. Well, those are arguably the most isolated states for their borders of any states in the country. And now, after the elections, you had 4 more states. Everybody's focused on California, the 6th largest economy in the world. But guess what? California's borders are also isolated. As a matter of fact, so are Nevada's that just came along, and Maine's, which came along also to have adult use as of last November. Massachusetts is the state that's different, because Massachusetts has millions and millions of people living across its borders. And here's a shocker for you: pot finds its way over borders. And if the intent of prohibition was to constrain the plant, I don't know if that's possible anymore with respect to Massachusetts in particular. So now I want to just wrap this up by sharing with you this statement about the science that we're here for, the ethical reasoning, and to really advance this to the point to where, as responsible citizens, forget a healer part a minute, you're a citizen too, this matters. Because what's going to happen now is that with the continuation of the political things that's going in the name of an indulgence temptation, we can think of this just that way. It doesn't have to be about pot illegal. There's opiates, there's sugary drinks, there's gambling, there's sex. An indulgence temptation is going to offer choices. And those choices can be really thought of as things that caution us to really be careful what we wish for. And that genie that gives 2 wishes, the third one's the zinger, right? You get 2, they lead you there. When this does happen, to eventually come out of federal prohibition, be very careful with what happens then. Schedule 2 would make it like an opiate, a controlled substance. Many people think that's not enough. But for the age of discovery, it would be very powerful for us as physicians to actually be able to prescribe it, because then we'd be forced to educating ourselves on it. We'd be forced to following up and finding the clinical effects, which is outcome. That's what's needed in this thing, this situation. Right now, everything has been progressing across the country based on plant outcome and patient access. But until measures that advocate and promote patient outcome are there on these books, no state's got it right yet. I really think that Florida can do better in the future to set trends that eventually federally would focus on patient outcome, because that's what matters. As a matter of fact, science and reason matter in this, which is why we're bringing it up. So I want to move ahead, and I don't know how we are in time, but we'll have some questions and answers in a panel. Pot today, remember we were talking about cannabis as far as the endocannabinoid system. Here's the pot, that's the plant. The plant's normally a 20-foot plant, and it's easy to spot from a helicopter. That's not what's grown nowadays. That's more like the hemp varietal. In 1971, this is the plant that became the darling of industry because it's a 4-foot plant. It's called an Afghani Kush number 1. High THC, flowers freely, 4 foot high, you can conceal it, and it carried along with it a particularly hypnotic terpene. I said hypnotic, not relaxing, not sedating, not calming. Myrcene is what's in some plants, and particularly in hops, actually, which is the genetic closest relative to cannabis, hops, like in beer. It's not sedating, calming, or relaxing as much as it is hypnotic. The contributing myrcene as a terpene that I told you is one of the component chemicals of hops and of cannabis, in this varietal of cannabis, is what gives people that stoner effect. That's hypnotic. It's different. If a doc tells you after the weekend you've had surgery, go home, convalesce, maybe myrcene's okay in that context. But come Monday morning, that's not your medicine if you're taking something for pain. It's not convalescing. Being hypnotic is not consistent with productivity. So in essence then, this is what the larger plants look like, yet it's still illegal. So this is now what's grown indoors. 4-foot plants, huge, what they call buds. Those trichomes, those are the white frosting things, are there, and the plant's loss of normal chemicals. They don't have the normal balance in chemicals anymore. So this is from CNN.
It's especially good for little kids who are taking it as a medicine. No matter the method, THC goes through your bloodstream and into your brain. And there, the THC is going to latch onto these special receptors. When they are stimulated, you release dopamine. It sends signals to various nerve cells all around your body and makes the user feel high. Not all cannabis is going to get you stoned. That's because marijuana contains another chemical known as CBD. That's cannabidiol. Marijuana plants that have low THC and high CBD can work really well as a medicine. They can treat things like epilepsy. It works because the CBD chemical can quiet excessive electrical and chemical activity in the brain. I know this 3-year-old girl who went from having 300 seizures a week to 2 per month after her parents gave her cannabis with high levels of CBD. When it comes to marijuana, there's some 500 different chemical compounds. All these compounds work together. It's something known as the entourage effect. It's important because you can't just take a chemical out of marijuana and make a medicine. You need the whole plant, especially when it comes to using pot instead of pills.
So the combination of chemicals, and I mentioned terpenes before, can be seen. You could do analyses for these, and the value of knowing not only the cannabinoids as a clinician, if you were to want to know the effects, it's important to know those other effects from terpenes that give the plant its character. Olfactory sensation figuring into memory is key. How many people have ever smelled something that they haven't smelled in 30 or 40 years and it comes back just like that? It's a fascinating vestigial part close to the brainstem, actually. And so the power of smells in plants is not to be discluded. So there are many different types of things. Some things, lemon, pine, lavender. These are all different fragrances that have different effects. Lemon gives you the sense like you get a towel at the airport warm when you're flying and they'll give it to you to wipe. It makes you feel clean. It may not be the dirtiest towel you ever had, but the fact that it makes it so it feels clean is important. Soaps that have lavender infusions in them, right? To get it in a steamy shower relaxes you. Smells play incredibly with this. It's the essence of aromatherapy, and it's in the plant's chemicals themselves. So separating out chemicals is not good in terms of the whole plant's way it's looked at. And it actually, Deepak Chopra, everybody know Deepak Chopra. I love this kind of a phrase because he says when isolating a constituent from a plant, it's an affront to nature. It's like taking the intelligence and leaving the wisdom behind. And this is what the ancients would have known. And so in essence, we've advanced now not from the ancients, we're here in modern times. And so the fair warning to the current plant, which has pushed THC to levels that it was never intended to be. Anybody know what the cannabis cup is? Okay, it's the award given to the finest strains as far as in popular culture. When I'm a kid growing up here, cannabis is going to be about 4% THC. Now plants approaching 30% are out there. So the overall use and abuse, the amount that people take, I love the palindrome here about one substantial fact about substance use. If you can't control your dose can control you. And the difference from 1978 to now is huge. Okay, and so this is back then. But in terms of the actual place where the chemicals come from, those buds of the plants are frosted in that other picture. This is why. This is a close-up. If you see those frostings, actually, if you look at the little insert picture all the way to the left, look like little golf tees with golf balls on the top of a tee. That's the chemical factory for where the plants are. The plants use that as a way to generally avoid desiccation. They're lipids. And these lipid compounds protect the plant against desiccation. That's the factories where both terpenes and the cannabinoids are. But as you can see in the bottom, the change of the amount that's in it from 1970s till now is profound. So the reason that's important to know is that probably the plants that existed pre-1970s were of better balance, because the plant has been sort of pushed for the THC under prohibition, that which is prohibited, to being high on the right side there, and now more recently encouraging plants to have CBD, that other valuable chemical that was lost and still will not be found to any appreciable degree in most current plants. It has to be sought out from people wanting to see that CBD balancing part. And in essence then, this is not that different than what happened in alcohol prohibition, because in alcohol prohibition, anybody know what the most popular alcoholic beverage was before alcohol was prohibited back in the 20s? By far, beer. That's right. Why? Fermentation purifies water. More people still die from impure water, probably globally, than anything else. As well as that has calories. You didn't have the problems that we have today. So for a source of fluid, clean water with calories, beer was in everybody's home at about 4% alcohol, if that. So that's fermentation from what existed before alcohol prohibition, which immediately jumps up to spirits with prohibition of alcohol, or moonshine, super concentrated spirits, because the penalties, if you get caught with beer, what do you want to be? Caught with beer or caught with spirits if it's illegal? Okay, or moonshine. So in essence, that cannabis cup mentality of high THC and very little else is almost being grown and shared even culturally with the Stills in the Hills mentality that says, oh, well, this is the new thing. Be cautious of that. It really does no longer represent the natural balance that existed many, many, many years ago. So for treating, be careful with how much you start with. If anybody is a clinician who might have taken the course I did and is authorizing patients for cannabis here or outside in another state, the general mantra of start low and go slow, with the Finding Nemo, stone tortoise there, is really where the message is. And so in doing it that way, the reason I'm saying this is almost all, not all, but almost all therapeutic contributions from cannabinoids occur in a relatively small dose response curve. That's an inverted U. It means too little, no response. You get to that sweet spot, and there is a response. Too much, no response, or even worse. When you're thinking about pain, most people who use cannabis for pain fly right past that therapeutic dose level, and then they're chasing for more and more, thinking they haven't had enough. That's why they're not doing better. That's because they're thinking in the opiate realm of, well, tolerance and stuff. No, you got to hit that sweet spot of the therapeutic window in order for it to be efficacious. So where has things gone really since 2014? This was popular, you heard Gupta before, and this was from 2014. In 2015, it hits mainstream media. And then in 2016, you had the NIH actually doing wonderful things, because they were actually at that point dealing shared access data. The Human Genome Project, again, is shared. And so I want to speak with you a second about where this is going in the future. Well, if you are authorizing patients, be concerned, because the boards of medicine will want to see what they don't yet know. Did a doctor breach a minimum standard of care? That's what they're there for. Well, guess what? There's no best practices determined yet, so how can you define a minimum standard if you don't know the best practice? So this was published last May actually, by the Federation of State Medical Boards, the parent organization for this, and 10 practice expectation guidelines that were expected. This was a JAMA article, appeared in August, right after the DEA said for the time being it's going to stay Schedule 1, but this is what's expected from practitioners. The very first advice was that those physicians who are licensed and are authorizing should themselves abstain from it, not authorize family members. Doctors are going to be held to a very high standard in this, and that's not at all inappropriate. So the science is fascinating, though, for research. This is something that was published this past year, also came out of Scripps Institute, right up the coast near Jupiter. And along with Chinese researchers, it may be a little hard to see, but if you look closely in the middle of the top of those squiggly things, which are the receptor structure itself, this is an actual picture I'm going to show you of a real CB1 receptor. And it looks cartoonish, but it's to scale, and it represents a test chemical, which is the chemical on top. See the AM6535, constructed that would interact with the CB1 receptor to show those electromagnetic fields that find a chemical that lands on a receptor and makes the downstream action. So this is how cool the science is now, because here, if you see a little closer, the green and the blue structures there, Well, those structures then, if you look, are actually a molecule which has receptor fields around it. Remember, these are electrons, and it fits in those squiggly lines at that exact position. So now when pharmaceutical companies are working, they take a little oxygen off here or put another carbon there, change the shape of the interacting molecule in order to affect the downstream effects from that CB1 receptor. This is cool stuff. This is an actual picture of a CB1 receptor. So the other thing is not so much that future, but the past combined. And I'm going to conclude with this slide because this is where we are in the 21st century with genetics. You know, it's not just human genetics. Within 3 years after the human genome was finished in 2003, Arabidopsis, the first plant was actually found for its genetics. Each of those lines on the right represents a different cannabis strain for its genomics. And the reason I positioned it like this, you know, you can go and find out your parental heritage, right? Take a little cheek swab, they send you back, here's who your ancestors are. Well, that's pretty cool. You can do the same thing with plants. And when you do it with plants, imagine if you could take a certain plant's genetics from where it, as cannabis, may have evolved in one part of the world. Remember, it came from the eastern slopes of the Himalayas, so you know there's one selection of people in Asia who used it. You go to the Indian subcontinent, another. Africa, another. And so the way the plant evolved for thousands of years under human agriculture may have some similar ancestral roots that can connect back, because when you search for the genetic roots of a plant, I can tell you that in the 70s through the 90s, after Vietnam, you had people who returned from Vietnam who literally went on what they used to call the hippie backpack trail, seeking out those things they remembered from Asia, Thai stick, things like that, that to them was the Holy Grail. And you know what? They're extinct the same way because they're hybridized and changed, so they don't exist as the way they were before. But through the genetics, you can actually start to separate things out and look for that particular chemical that may have been in there that offered that culture the best balance. The reason this is cool is that it's almost the perfect time for when this kind of a science could advance globally, because everybody already has the plant, right? And if everybody had hardware that allowed them to find whatever parts of code and put it back into another plant, that's powerful, because global communications and the sharing of data is where we are now. If you consider that there's a synergy across the globe by bringing this together into light, those are the component parts to personalized medicine right there. And yet, under federal law, you can't share so much of a seed as moving from here across a state line. And that's a major confounder. But if the plant's everywhere and the hardware of genetics, everybody know what CRISPR is? You take a certain section of code out and put it in another plant. It's done for food crops already, easily, so that the food has an ability to withstand, insects or climates. In plant evolution, when you can apply that, while you can't transport as much as a seed across state lines, you know what you can transport? Code. Push a click on a mouse, everybody's already got it. And it would be really interesting if in the future you could in fact expedite this. It's almost the perfect time as far as the technology for the Uberization of exploiting maybe what the plant holds in secrets. It's just a tempting thought for where the future is. But in the meantime, if you stay and you look too close at things from an integrative medicine as an academician, and you're peering too close to it. I love this Norman Rockwell slide, because if you study it too closely, you lose the forest for the trees. And when you see the characters outside mocking that young, eager scientist, it sort of begs to understand how the balanced way you look at things from what you're all here today, East meets West, integrating all these things need to be seen from a higher platform to take full effect. So on that note, thanks for your time, and I'll hopefully be part of the panel.